January 10, 1969. The cameras were rolling. Twickenham Film Studios, West London. Cold, industrial. A cavernous warehouse that amplified every awkward silence, every frustrated sigh, every word that shouldn't have been said. The Beatles had been here for 10 days, trying to create an album, trying to recapture something they'd lost. George Harrison sat with his guitar, 25 years old, exhausted. 7 years of being told what to play, how to play it, when to smile for the camera. 7 years of standing slightly behind John and Paul in photographs. 7 years of watching his songs get pushed to B-sides while McCartney took the spotlight. 7 years of being treated like the little brother who should just be grateful he was invited. Across from him, Paul McCartney was demonstrating a guitar part. Again, Paul had opinions about everything. The tempo, the arrangement, the way George's fingers should move across the fretboard. "No, George, like this," Paul said, picking up a guitar. His tone wasn't cruel. It wasn't even dismissive. It was worse. It was patient. The kind of patience you use with a child who isn't quite getting it. George watched Paul's fingers. Correct. Precise. Mechanical. Everything Paul did was correct. That was what made it unbearable. "I'll play whatever you want me to play," George said quietly. His voice was flat, drained of everything except resignation. "Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play." The words hung in the cold air. The cameras kept rolling. History was being documented, though nobody in that room understood yet that this was the beginning of the end. Paul looked at him, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" George stood up, slowly, like a man who'd been sitting far too long and finally remembered he had the option to leave. "Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." The sarcasm was barely there, just a trace, enough to make Paul's jaw tighten. To understand why George Harrison walked out that day, you have to go back to 1958, to a bus in Liverpool. Paul McCartney was 15, George Harrison was 14. They rode the same bus to school. Paul noticed George one day. Younger, quieter, but clearly obsessed with guitars. George could play, really play, lead guitar, riffs, the intricate stuff that made rock and roll dangerous. John Lennon's band needed a lead guitarist. Paul vouched for George, brought him to audition. George played raunchy note perfect on the top deck of a bus. John was skeptical. George was too young, but Paul insisted. George got in, because of Paul, and George never forgot it. Hamburg 1960. 8 hours a night, amphetamines and exhaustion, and the kind of education you can't get in music school. George was 17, the baby of the group. John was the leader. Paul was the charmer. And George was the kid. "Come on, Georgie," Paul would say, half affectionate, half dismissive. "Keep up." George kept up, more than kept up. By 1962, George Harrison was one of the finest guitarists in England. His solos on "And I Love Her" and "I Feel Fine" weren't just competent, they were definitive. The sound of the Beatles was as much George's guitar as it was John's voice or Paul's bass lines. But the songs were Lennon-McCartney. Always, even when George started writing beautiful songs, they were relegated. B-sides, album filler, 2 George songs per album, if he was lucky. Meanwhile, John and Paul churned out hit after hit, their names immortalized in that hyphenated partnership that seemed designed to exclude everyone else. George learned to wait his turn, learned to be patient, learned to be grateful, but something was growing inside him, something bitter and tired and ready to snap. By 1968, the cracks were everywhere. John brought Yoko Ono into the studio, broke the unspoken rule that wives stayed outside. Paul's response was to work harder, control more. And George had been to India, had studied with Ravi Shankar, had written songs, really good songs, like "While My Guitar Gently Weeps." Instead, Paul suggested changes. John barely paid attention. Ringo quit for 2 weeks because the atmosphere was so toxic. George was writing the best music of his life, and nobody seemed to notice. Twickenham Studios, the Get Back sessions. The concept sounded good. Get back to basics. Just 4 guys playing live. Film it. Make it real. Reality was cold and unbearable. They'd arrive at 8 a.m., far too early for musicians who'd worked nights for a decade. The warehouse was freezing. Yoko was there, sitting next to John. Paul was running the show because someone had to, and John was too distant, and George was too young, and Ringo just wanted everyone to get along. George brought in songs, All Things Must Pass, Let It Down, beautiful mature composition. Paul barely glanced at them. Maybe later, George. Let's focus on getting this album done first. Let's focus on Paul's songs, on John's songs, on Lennon-McCartney. On January 7th, Paul was teaching George a guitar part for two of us. Not suggesting, teaching. George's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. January 8th, another day of Paul directing, controlling. George played what he was told to play, waited for his turn that never came. January 9th, Paul suggested a change to I Me Mine, one of George's songs. George nodded. Sure, Paul, whatever you think. His voice was empty. January 10th, the cameras were rolling. Morning, cold, John distant, Yoko beside him, Paul energetic in his element, Ringo trying to keep the peace, and George sitting with his guitar, watching Paul demonstrate another part. No, George, like this, patient, helpful, entirely reasonable. And suddenly George couldn't do it anymore, couldn't be the little brother, couldn't be grateful for being allowed in the room where John and Paul made all the decisions. I'll play whatever you want me to play, George said, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Paul frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it. The air in Twickenham froze. John looked up, alert for the first time in days. Ringo's face went carefully neutral. Paul tried to laugh it off. George, I'm just trying to. I know what you're trying to do, Paul. George's voice was quiet, not angry, just done. You've been trying to do it for 10 years. That's not fair. I've been playing your guitar parts, singing your harmonies, standing in your shadow since I was 14 years old. George stood up. And I'm tired. We're all tired, George, but we have a job to. I quit. The words landed like stones in water, ripples spreading outward. Unstoppable. You what? Paul's voice rose. George, don't be ridiculous. We're in the middle of. I quit the Beatles. George unplugged his guitar, carefully, gently. I'm done. John finally spoke. You can't quit. We're making an album. Then make it without me. George looked at Paul, really looked at him. You don't need me anyway. You never did. He walked toward the door. Paul followed, still trying to fix it, still trying to control the situation. George, wait. Let's talk about this. What do you want? More songs? Fine. You can have 3 songs on the album, 4 even. George stopped, turned. It's not about the songs, Paul. Then what is it about? It's about respect. George's eyes were tired. It's about being treated like an equal, instead of a session musician. It's about anyone, listening when I have something to say. Paul opened his mouth, closed it. He didn't understand. How could he? Paul McCartney had been the center of attention since he was 15 years old. He'd never stood in anyone's shadow. George walked out. The door closed behind him. The cameras kept rolling. The Beatles suddenly had only 3 members. 5 days later, Ringo went to George's house. Not Paul, not John. Ringo, the peacekeeper, the diplomat. We miss you, Ringo said simply. It's not the same. George shook his head. I'm not going back to being treated like that. What if we moved to Apple Studios? Smaller, warmer, no cameras everywhere. Ringo paused. And I'll talk to Paul, make sure he listens more. George was silent. He'd been in the Beatles since he was 15 years old. It wasn't just a band. It was his entire life, his identity, his family. I'll think about it, George said finally. 2 days later, he came back, but things were different. They moved to Apple Studios. Billy Preston joined them on keyboards. George's idea, a buffer. The atmosphere improved, slightly. George got more songs on the album, small victories, temporary compromises, but the damage was done. The moment George walked out, everyone knew the Beatles would end. It was just a question of when. By September 1969, they'd finished Abbey Road. In that iconic photograph on the zebra crossing, George is third in line, behind John, behind Paul, right where he'd always been. In April 1970, Paul announced the Beatles were over. George wasn't surprised. He'd left 9 months earlier. Even if he'd physically come back, the part of him that believed in the Beatles had walked out at Twickenham and never returned. And here's the strangest part. George Harrison was right. In 1970, he released All Things Must Pass, a triple album of songs he'd been stockpiling, songs the Beatles hadn't had time for, songs Paul thought could wait. It became the best-selling album by any solo Beatle. My Sweet Lord went to #1 worldwide. Critics called it a masterpiece. George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, the little brother, the sideman, he'd been carrying a masterpiece inside him all along. Paul was shocked, John was impressed, and George was finally free. He'd tried to tell them, but sometimes the only way to be heard is to stop waiting for permission to speak. Years later, in the 1990s, when the surviving Beatles reunited for the anthology project, Paul and George sat together in a studio, older, grayer, softer. "I'm sorry," Paul said quietly, "about Twickenham, about all of it." George looked at him. The anger was gone. What remained was acceptance. "We were kids, Paul. None of us knew what we were doing." "You knew," Paul said. "You were trying to tell us. I should have listened." George smiled. Small, tired, water under the bridge. George Harrison died in 2001. Paul was there at the end, along with Ringo. They said goodbye properly, said the things that needed saying, and Paul thought about that day in January 9. The cameras rolling, George standing up, the moment everything broke. What if he'd listened? What if he'd seen George as an equal, instead of the kid from the bus? What if the Beatles had been 4 partners instead of 2 songwriters and 2 sidemen? We'll never know. What we do know is this. On January 10, 1969, George Harrison walked out on the Beatles, not because of one comment, not because of one bad day, but because of 10 years of small cuts, tiny dismissals, moments of being overlooked, that accumulated into something unbearable. Paul McCartney didn't mean to make George snap. He was just being Paul, confident in control. Sure, he knew best, but George Harrison wasn't just a guitar player. He was a Beatle, an artist, a man who'd spent half his life in someone else's shadow, and finally found the courage to step into the light, even if it meant walking away from everything he'd ever known. The cameras captured it all. The footage sat in vaults for decades. Then in 2021, Peter Jackson used it for the Get Back documentary. Millions watched George Harrison walk out, watched Paul look confused, watched John look concerned, watched Ringo look heartbroken, and everyone finally understood. The Beatles didn't end because of Yoko, or because of business disputes, or because they got too famous. The Beatles ended because George Harrison finally had enough, and on a cold January day in 1969, he did something brave and terrible and necessary. He let